Thanks, Andrew. It's nice to have a fellow Brit, you know, it makes me feel really at home. So this is me in 1996. I'm in this picture. If you can figure out which one I am, then I'll buy you a beer after the event. Oops, I didn't turn the slide on. There you are. Now you can figure out which one. I'll buy you 2 beers if you get this one right. And I was part of the incipient stages of the anti-GMO movement as it began its life, to my knowledge at that point, in the UK in about 1995, 1996. This was an oilseed rape, as we call it, canola trial, farm-scale trial, which was government-run and which we trashed by rolling on it during the daytime for the attention of the media. This was a kind of a for-the-cameras event. But we also did nighttime actions, decontamination actions, as we called them, where we went and destroyed. I think I've personally destroyed maize, so corn, sugar beet, various other crops, all because we considered this to be a serious threat to human health and to the environment. Now, we employed a lot of very strong emotional imagery. In this case, this is Greenpeace protesters. I'm told the fangs on the GMO corn only come out at night, so you can't see them during the daytime. And if I think back to what we were objecting to, I think in many ways it was actually an objection to science itself. I remember thinking that scientists had gone too far with this new technology which enabled them to move genes between unrelated species. I really thought this was a technology which should never have been developed. It conferred a power on humanity which we wouldn't be able to deploy responsibly. Now, in retrospect, this was pretty ignorant. I don't think I knew that DNA is just a coding system and that it's a coding system shared between all living things, from viruses to trees to ourselves, of course. And I didn't know either that humans share 30% of our genome with carrots. And there's no such thing as human DNA or carroty DNA. There's nothing intrinsic about them. It's just the coding system. We talked a lot about the precautionary principle, the Donald Rumsfeld's famous unknown unknowns, and felt, I think, that we shouldn't do something which would have potentially unintended consequences, which had some level of risk attached to it. But I think we forgot the flip side of that, which is that it also might have benefits, intended or unintended. The only benefits that we saw were to multinational corporations like the evil Monsanto, who we were already against. And in fact, I organized what may have been the first action against Monsanto. I printed the flyers, organized the buses, and we got into, I can't remember exactly how we got in, but we got into their headquarters and dropped banners and messed up their files and did all the kinds of things that activists do. Now, I wasn't a full-time crop trasher, not least because I didn't really like being chased by the police. I'm a natural and quite dedicated coward, and lying face down in the mud while being sniffed by police dogs wasn't my idea of a career. And I also wanted to be a writer, and I was increasingly concerned about this issue of climate change. So I embarked on a project starting in the year 2000, which was to document and catalogue the real-world impacts of climate change. It sounds humdrum now, but at the time, I promise you, this was very innovative. No one had done it before. And the centerpiece of the resulting book, High Tide, was this picture of the same glacier. The left-hand one taken by my father in 1980 when he was working in this particular part of the Peruvian Andes as a geologist, and the right-hand one taken by us when we went back in 2002. You may have seen these photos in Al Gore's movie An Inconvenient Truth, although he wrongly identifies the location as Argentina. But these photos do illustrate a worldwide trend towards the loss of glacial mass in mountain regions, and that's one of the primary signifiers of global warming. And it's something which has direct human impacts to the populations of countries like Peru, who depend on the water resources, the fresh water resources, which are locked up in these mountain glaciers. I won't go through all of the different locations, but I also went to Tuvalu, to one of the small island states which is most vulnerable to sea level rise, and took some photos of how high tides are beginning to wash into people's houses. and affect people's daily lives. Now, I was beginning to develop an awareness that to make this book persuasive, it needed to be more than just a collection of observations. Data not being the plural of anecdote, I needed to have the data to show that what I was illustrating anecdotally here was a real world trend. So I began to look at the satellite records of sea level rise, for example, what the tide gauges were saying here in Tuvalu and elsewhere around the world, to try and be more confident that what I was trying to get communicated to the world on climate change was actually a real phenomenon. Now, my background is not as a scientist. I have an MA in history and politics for my sins from the University of Edinburgh. And so this was a whole new dimension to my life, was locking myself down here in the Radcliffe Science Library of Oxford University for well nigh on 2 years and learning about all the different academic journals and what the peer review system meant and looking at the statistical methodologies and the climate models and all of this kind of stuff, which was not only fascinating but was eye-opening in a way which I'd never anticipated. Not only did I start to understand and gain an appreciation for the natural sciences, but I began also to understand and almost fall in love with how science works itself as a process, how evidence-based knowledge, which of course is always provisional, but it's still 1,000 times better than non-evidence-based assertion, and how science in this sense could come closer than anything else to true objectivity and therefore has a special claim to truth. And my new love was, as Andrew said, to a certain extent requited by the scientific community, who, in the form of the Royal Society, awarded my 6 Degrees book their Science Books Prize in 2008. So I began to feel a part, to a certain extent, as a writer of the scientific community. I got to know many of the key scientists working in the fields of geophysics and climatology and glaciology and all of that kind of stuff, and to gain a really intense respect for the hard work that they did and the battles that they had to fight. And I wanted to fight, to ride out in defense of them, because the community as a whole was beginning to come under attack from the climate skeptics. When I was promoting the National Geographic iteration of 6 Degrees, so the movie, here in the US in must have been in late 2008, I did a week of radio phone-in shows with small-town radio stations across the United States. And I began to, how would you say, gain an appreciation for the difference of opinion on this issue, which I had no experience of really in the UK context. People would phone up and they would scream and shout about how this was all an invention, it was a hoax, it was a left-wing plot to take over the world, and so on. And so I began to gain some experience of beginning to argue with this new breed of climate change deniers who were beginning to take over the political debate and eventually gain a fair degree of control over the entire Republican Party. And I tried to explain to them what made science special and different, about the need to understand what the peer review system is, to respect the scientific consensus on this issue, and to have an evidence-based worldview and address our policies on that basis. But at the same time, it hadn't occurred to me still that there was an inconsistency between defending climate science and attacking the science of biotechnology. And this is up there, that's my last and still utterly embarrassing last anti-GMO article, which I wrote for The Guardian in 2008, in my defense at the behest of their editors, who said, look, you can knock this together in 20 minutes. You've done it 1,000 times before, and which is what I duly did. And you can tell from reading that was how this article came about. And many of the strong negative comments which you can read underneath that made me think that I wasn't upholding the same standards on this issue that I was trying to maintain on climate change. And I began to realize that I was undermining my own credibility as a science writer by maintaining pretty much an unsupportable position on biotechnology, at the same time as defending the consensus on climate science. So there were some, perhaps in retrospect, there were some good selfish reasons why I needed to reconsider, but I did know that changing my position would put me in pretty stark conflict with my colleagues in the environmental movement. So I did the brave thing and said absolutely nothing for about 2 to 3 years, and did some more reading, and began to try to get an understanding of the literature in a way which I hoped I already had in climate change. And as an aside, in 2008, so I kept my focus on climate change. I was appointed as advisor to the president of the Maldives, President Mohammed Nasheed, who was at that point the Maldives' first democratically elected president, following in the heels of a 30-year dictatorship. And on that picture on the left, I'm with President Nasheed in Copenhagen at the UN negotiations, where we tried our damnedest to hold the line for 350 parts per million and for a maximum temperature limitation of 1.5 degrees, because my assessment of the science was that if you wanted to defend the interests of a small island, coral atoll, vulnerable nation like the Maldives, those were the targets, the maximum degree of tolerable climate change to which the world should accept. By the way, this week, President Nasheed won the first round of the presidential elections in the Maldives after having lost power in a coup. The second round has now been cancelled by the Supreme Court at the behest of the brother-in-law of the former dictator. So if you care about democracy in this and any other country, please do what you can to raise attention to this. Now, I did finally come off the GMO fence in my book, The God Species, which Andrew kindly mentioned, which was published in 2011. And I took a literature review approach to how I was constructing these chapters. So I didn't start with a hypothesis and go and seek the evidence to try and support it. I developed a knowledge and appreciation of all of the journals that I could possibly look at and just went through them methodically. Journal after journal after journal. I must have been through dozens of them. I had a big Excel spreadsheet, and I just pieced together a picture of what was in the literature about the different areas that I was trying to cover, which varied from the alteration of the nitrogen cycle to land use change to biodiversity loss. And I ended up writing quite a pro-GMO chapter because I was increasingly fascinated by how these new genetic traits which scientists were developing could be used to reduce toxic insecticide applications, to make crops more drought and climate change tolerant, and to improve productivity and thereby use land more efficiently. Now, this did not cause a furore, not least because nobody reads great big long books about the environment anymore. So this passed more or less unnoticed. A lot of the book was still about climate change. It's worth just reminding ourselves that at the very basic level, the Earth is in energy imbalance, that this imbalance is now quite well constrained and quite well quantified. I'm told that the gain in heat is like exploding a Hiroshima-sized atomic bomb in the oceans every single second for the last 30 years. And this gain in heat, of course, is a direct consequence of the increased forcing effect of the accumulating man-made greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which trap outgoing long-wave radiation so that more heat is retained in the system than escapes to space. Now, the vast majority of this heat, by the way, is going into the oceans. So this whole big furore currently about where's the missing heat, what happened to global warming, is not really justified by the science. The atmosphere actually has a very limited heat storage capacity, only about 2% of the Earth system. The rest of it goes into the oceans. So the question is about how the increased heat which is now being retained in the Earth system is distributed between the oceans and the atmosphere, not whether the planet is still warming. I would contend that the skeptics have successfully caused false doubt about this issue and about some very well-established physics, which is why I call them deniers, which is a strong label. I accept that. But I would contend that this is an anti-science agenda aimed explicitly at ideological and political ends. Now, tomorrow, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is publishing the summary for policymakers of the fifth assessment report. Do not cite or quote the material I'm presenting here because it's from the leaked draft. which I'm only presenting, this is breaking the academic rules, I'm only presenting this because it's all over the internet and many of you will probably have already seen it. But note, and I think this is unlikely to change, but note the degree of confidence which is now expressed about much of the knowledge base of climate change here. Extremely likely, which if you follow through what that means 95 to 100% probability. Extremely likely that the human influence on the climate is now, or more than half the observed increase in temperature is due to human activity since the 1950s. Virtually certain, which is as close to 100% as it's possible to get and still call yourself a scientist, virtually certain that the upper layers of the ocean have warmed since the 1970s, and virtually certain also that the troposphere has warmed and the stratosphere has cooled, which is exactly what you'd expect from the greenhouse gas fingerprint. Now, this scientific consensus is not merely articulated by the IPCC, although it's very usefully done, and I think the IPCC has a very useful role in informing lay people and informing the media and informing policymakers. Also, the various academic institutions echo these statements and tend to put a bit more of a policy drive on them as well. So here's the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, saying global climate change caused by human activities is occurring now, and then saying very strongly at the end, the time to control greenhouse gas emissions is now, which is a policy statement that you won't get from the IPCC. Now, there's no IPCC for genetically modified organisms, so we have to look at specific statements made by specific institutions. I've collected a few of them onto this slide. This slide, by the way, won't fit onto the screen. It's 3 times as long as what can be projected there. So this is just a few examples which you probably can't even read, but they're there, believe me, from the World Health Organization, the US National Academy of Sciences, the Royal Society, even the European Commission, and so on. And if we zoom in on the statement produced by the AAAS on biotechnology, it's almost the same, and this is really striking, it's almost the same language as is used on the climate change consensus statement. The science is quite clear. Crop improvement by modern molecular techniques of biotechnology is safe. And they're lower down. Consuming foods containing ingredients from GM crops is no riskier than conventional. So I think this very clearly shows the inconsistency of supporting climate change science and this consensus on climate change science and attacking an equivalent consensus on the safety of biotechnology, and puts anti-GMO campaigners into the same intellectual and scientific category as the climate change deniers. And in fact, anti-GMO people have been called the climate deniers of the left, reflecting the fact that these are very different political ideologies in play here, but each side, whether it's on climate or GMOs, finds the science highly inconvenient, to borrow Al Gore's phrase. And actually, reading the AAAS statement, which was produced in October 2012, gave me the confidence to speak very bluntly when I was invited to address the Oxford Farming Conference in January this year. And it's worth noting that what made the speech go viral and make headlines around the world from China to Argentina wasn't because I am interesting, and it wasn't because I was pointing out scientific inconsistencies in the consensus. It was because there was this great story of the former anti-GMO activist apologizing to the farming community. And I did this because I felt very strongly that I have a debt to pay for having, even to a small extent, helped mislead the world more than a decade earlier when I was an anti-GMO activist with only the very shallowest understanding of the science. Now, it would be an understatement to say there's been something of a backlash from the anti-GMO lobby. Can you read this? Just read the last sentence there. Of course, this is an entirely ad hominem attack, trying to discredit me as a shill who's been paid by the biotech industry. Of course, that's not true. I haven't received a penny from Monsanto or any other biotech company, but it fits the anti-GMO frame as it being big corporations behind this entire technology. There's something integral. What bothers me most of all, actually, is that this isn't even me. So they photoshopped some other industry shill onto this background, and I would happily have posed. Now, I'm sure many of you will agree that this isn't, of course, just a scientific issue. There may be, of course, a scientific consensus about the safety of GMOs that are currently available. That doesn't mean, of course, that all future GMOs will always be safe. We have to have a case-by-case evidence-based approach to this. But what does it mean about how appropriate biotech crops might be for farmers in developing countries? What about the worries of corporate monopolization and the patenting of seeds? And I'm just as interested in the socioeconomic context, the political context of this. What I've tried to do really is to look at the real world and particular case studies rather than have this argument in the abstract. So, for example, if you're concerned about corporate monopolization, why not support public sector scientists in Africa who are developing pest and disease resistant biotech crops which are given out free to farmers? Opposing an entire technology on the basis of how some people might use it is not even logical. It's like trying to ban mobile phones because you object to the dominant position of Apple. And by the way, Apple is the biggest company in the world at the moment, nearly $500 billion in terms of turnover, and I've seen a lot of anti-corporate activists tapping away on their iPhones. And there's some really real costs, potentially, about foregoing the benefits of this technology in the developing world in particular, on the basis of abstract concerns which are mostly held in rich countries. So to look at one example which really struck me when I was on a recent visit to Africa, supported, by the way, by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, this farmer in Tanzania owned an acre of unirrigated, infertile land and was pretty much entirely dependent on cassava as his staple food crop. And you can see, as he's standing there, the cassava crop is not healthy. It's being assaulted by two different viruses, the cassava brown streak virus and the cassava mosaic virus. And we dug up one or two of the roots, which are the bits of the plant that people eat, and they've gone brown, they're rotting, they're not going to provide a food source for this family. And this disease is already leaving people hungry. These children they have no backstop, they don't have any money, they can't go to the market and buy food. So they're dependent, they're proper subsistence farmers, they're dependent on what they can grow for what they can eat. And you can see the cassava plants in this picture also that's another apple going off. These are people who are dependent entirely for their sustenance on what they themselves can grow. And the kids, to my knowledge, in front of my eyes, were visibly malnourished. And they are some of the 800 million chronically malnourished people who are still with us in the world today. Now, their food security, as I said, is directly tied to the success or failure of their cassava crop. And because of these diseases, it's mostly now a case of failure. The healthiest cassava crops I saw in my entire 3 weeks in East Africa were on this one government-funded research station in a place called Namulonge in Uganda. And why were they healthy? Because they've been genetically engineered to be resistant to both viruses, with a very small sequence of viral DNA which makes the plant recognize the virus intrusions and deal with it. There are no other options. There's no chemical control strategies available at all to anyone. So they are safe. They've been tested to be safe. They're exactly the same varieties. They're the farmer-preferred varieties, simply with the transgenic DNA, which makes them able to resist the virus. And the plant, by the way, cassava plant is clonally propagated. It doesn't produce a pollen and seeds which are used. What you do is you chop bits out of it and you stick them in the ground and it makes a new cassava plant. So why can't the farmers use this virus-resistant GMO variety? Well, because it's held under lock and key and will remain so for the foreseeable future. If any of the scientists, public sector scientists who are working to develop this potentially important food security crop took it outside of that chain link fence, that padlock, they would potentially go to jail for 10 years under Kenya's biosafety laws. Why did this climate come about? Well, because of the intense anti-GMO superstition which has been spread by European-funded activist groups throughout Africa and many other parts of the developing world. I had personal experience of these groups when I was doing talks and interacting with farmers. In one talk I was doing in a very remote region of Tanzania, farmers who said they were organic farmers stood up and said that they would never grow GMOs because they were designed to turn their children homosexual. That this was a plot, a Western plot, to turn African people sterile and stop them breeding. I would have walked out if the statement hadn't been made in Swahili. And these activists who go around there insist that traditional is best, that only the farmer-saved seeds are appropriate for these vulnerable people to have. Even though these traditional seeds are very unproductive, are very non-resilient to drought, and also very susceptible to pest infestation. And don't forget, productivity matters the most for farmers and their families who are dependent for their sustenance and what they themselves can grow. Now, I fully accept that this is outside the realms of hard science. For me, this was a moral issue, and I felt very strongly about it when I was meeting these farmers. And I felt angry because, to me, it was a massive injustice that the most vulnerable and the poorest subsistence farmers in the world should be the ones who are denied the benefits of agricultural technology because of the irrational fears of well-fed European consumers who fund these activist groups. Another good example, perhaps, is this long saga of golden rice, which is much better known. This is me in the screenhouse at Erie at the International Rice Research Institute at the University of Los Baños in the Philippines. And what they're doing there is putting the genetic trait for the expression of vitamin A precursor, beta-carotene, into the farmer-preferred varieties of rice. So this isn't just one variety of rice which has to be grown across the whole of South and East Asia. The point is they have to get them into all of the varieties of rice that the farmers themselves want and the farmers are already growing. Otherwise the project won't work. It's aimed at addressing vitamin A deficiency. This, by the way, is a level 2 biosafety facility, as if the researchers were developing germ warfare rather than a nutritionally improved crop which could potentially save millions of lives. This is what's gotten so wrong with the regulatory framing of this whole issue. On the left here is Dr. Gerard Barry, who's the leader of the Golden Rice Project at Erie. The rice is yellow, of course, because it's got beta-carotene in it too, which is then turned by the body into vitamin A, just like carrots are orange. That's what the colouring comes from. There's enough in that jar, which he's holding, to give a child their entire daily allowance. But actually the scientists have limited the expression of beta-carotene in the rice to about 50% of what a child would need for the average amount they consume, in order to encourage people to adopt more varied and balanced diets with green leafy vegetables, fruits, and so on, because that's important for health on a much wider basis, of course. Now, what's happened recently? Well, activists have trashed one of those golden rice field trials. They posed as farmers, and they sent out press releases saying they were farmers and this was a farmer rebellion, but really these weren't farmers, these were activists who'd been bussed in from the towns. How do we know they weren't farmers? And the scientists who witnessed this happening were very clear about this. There's a cultural taboo on destroying a green rice plant in the Philippines. Even when they're diseased green rice plants in the field, farmers won't pull them out because you're not allowed to destroy a living rice plant. The activist group who are leading this destruction, by the way, were part funded by a Scandinavian government development agency. And the crop was 100% destroyed. And recently, in fact, this was only this week, scientists themselves, you might argue moving outside the realms of hard science, have expressed their own degrees of moral outrage. This editorial was signed by 11 top scientists, including Martin Rees, who's former president of the Royal Society, and Nina Fedorov, who you may know, she was former science advisor to Hillary Clinton when Clinton was Secretary of State. Note the figures that they quote here: 1.9 to 2.8 million preventable deaths caused by vitamin A deficiency around the world. And here we have the anti-GMO groups insisting that biofortification of staple crops to save potentially some of these lives should not even be tried on the basis of their ideological fears, which we know have no scientific validity. Now, to me, this is no different from the extreme Muslim anti-vaccine groups spreading rumours against the polio vaccination campaigns in Nigeria and elsewhere. Except that it's big names like Greenpeace who are behind the scaremongering. Now, those are humanitarian concerns. There are environmental concerns which appeal to me particularly as an environmentalist about how the promise of biotechnology has been foregone. For example, in Europe we have a big problem with potato blight. That's what it looks like when it gets your potatoes. A pretty nasty fungus which spreads very quickly in wet years. How's this controlled in conventional potato farming? Well, by the very liberal application of fungicides. The potatoes are on average sprayed about once per week in a bad year and once per fortnight in a good year. There's a lot of fungicide going down to go against blight. And there is, of course, a GMO potato which is blight resistant, which has been developed and which these farmers and any farmers have no chance of being able to adopt, because in Europe GMOs are banned in totality by a regulatory system which has no basis in science. Also interesting to me as an environmentalist is the potential to reduce insecticide and other pesticide applications using biotechnology. I think BT crops, cotton, corn and other BT applications have reduced insecticide applications by something like 500 million kilograms since the mid-1990s and have dramatically improved on-field biodiversity in parts of the world where this has been studied. Now, I think the structure of the industry is a problem here, actually. I don't want to see the same companies selling biotech seeds as selling chemicals and pesticides. I want to see the companies selling biotech seeds challenging the markets of those who are selling the pesticides. So I want to see biotechnology as a disruptive technology, moving as overall from the age of chemistry to the age of biology. And there are numerous examples of how we could increase productivity, we could increase environmental outcomes, potentially using biotechnology. I'm not suggesting it's a cure-all for all of the world's ills, but it's certainly a potentially very important part of the toolbox. This is Water Efficient Maize for Africa, another Gates-funded project, using technology developed by Monsanto, actually, for drought tolerance to increase productivity for African farmers who either don't have access to irrigation or to insure them against drought. When drought strikes at the moment, their crops will fail. Also of environmental concern is the issue of productivity. The yellow area in this graph is the land which has been spared by productivity increases since 1961, it says here. So if we'd use the technologies of 1960 today, we'd have to cultivate billions of hectares more of the planet's land. And this is the challenge really against organic farming, which is much less productive per unit area. If we're to produce the same amount of food, then we would have to bring more area, more natural ecosystems into cultivation. So we need to consider the wider displacement effects here. And that's particularly the case if you care about biodiversity loss, which I do. I think it's potentially the joint #1 global concern along with climate change. The key reason for biodiversity loss is, of course, habitat loss, and the key reason for habitat loss is conversion to agricultural land. So looking towards the future, we've got to somehow address this gap which is now emerging between productivity increases and the rate of human population growth. It's evident in cereals, it's evident in other staple crops as well. We also know that the world's population is going to hit 9.6 billion by 2050. We've got another 1 billion mouths to feed in the next 12 years. We can't do that by standing still in a technological sense. We've also got to address the need to continually reduce poverty and improve diets in developing countries where people are still undernourished, as I mentioned earlier. Overall, this gives us the challenge to raise overall production by about 100% by the middle of this century. So within 35 years or so from now. And if we're not to plough up all the remaining rainforests in Brazil, in Indonesia, in Africa, then this increase must come in its entirety from increasing the productivity of currently cultivated land. And as well, in the background of all this, we've got to also address some of the challenges, the environmental challenges, the externalities of conventional agriculture, which uses too much water, which uses too much nitrogen, which uses too much fossil fuel. So we've got to make agriculture sustainable at the same time as we increase productivity to address the need to produce 100% more food by mid-century. Now, as I'm a historian, so let's look back at history. We've had this kind of challenge before. In the late 1960s, population in a percentage sense was growing at its fastest rate ever, and many people made predictions of mass famine. Paul Ehrlich, of course, Garrett Harding, the leading ecologists of the time, not only did they predict that hundreds of billions of people would die in the 1970s from starvation, they did their best to bring that about by arguing against food aid transfers which would have fed hungry people and merely enabled them to simply reproduce again. Now, Norman Borlaug here was no cornucopian. He didn't believe that the invisible hand of the market would somehow magically provide the answers. He believed that feeding all these new people would require very hard work from dedicated agricultural scientists like himself. And the Green Revolution, for which he received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970, was first and foremost a productivity revolution. It was about getting much higher yields with better varieties of staple crops and using modern technologies for those people growing them, and getting these out to the poorest farmers, starting in Mexico, then moving out to Pakistan, to India, and successfully turning these countries from chronically famine-stricken nations dependent on food aid from the US and elsewhere to forestall starvation on an annual basis, turning them into food self-sufficient, indeed food exporting countries in the space of little more than a decade. Now, it's instructive that Norman Borlaug spent his final years before his death from leukemia in 2009 campaigning to save biotechnology from the tide of misinformation and fear spread by people like myself, as you can tell from that quote. He really believed that if the revolution in agricultural biotechnology was stopped, we might well see the famines which those trying to stop it have been predicting for so long. I met Borlaug's daughter, Jeannie Borlaug, for the first time a few weeks ago, and she told me over breakfast what his final words were. Someone was apparently at his bedside showing him some new agricultural innovation. I can't remember what it was, but the final words he ever spoke were, "Take it to the farmer." And for me, this is the last word also, that science can give us amazing new tools, but it can't tell us exactly how to deploy them. If we take it to the farmer, however, and if we give them the choice, then millions of potential beneficiaries can make their free choice of what is in their own best interests, rather than being prohibited from exercising their right to choose by others who would make their decisions for them on their behalf. But these potential beneficiaries, the farmers, and even the consumers, all of us, in fact, have to be well informed. And the best information, as I have learned the difficult way over the last 20 years, can only come about through science. Thank you very much.